All right, I think we should get started. It's 9:30. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Kissinger Institute's final event of 2017. Thank goodness. This is our 5th annual year in review of U.S.-China relations. My name is Sandy Phone. I'm the Senior Associate for the Kissinger Institute on China and the United States. And I'm also the editor of the Month in U.S.-China Relations newsletter. I hope many of you subscribe to this newsletter. But for those of you who do not, it is a monthly newsletter that provides readers a summary of major developments in the relationship. And in preparation for this event, I was looking through past newsletters, and it struck me how much has happened in the past 12 months. But unlike last year, when U.S.-China relations seemed somewhat manageable in spite of the many conflicts and tensions, the fundamental trajectory of the relationship seems to have shifted this year. Last year, the United States and China were trading jabs over the South China Sea, and they were ratifying climate deals. 1 year later, America has withdrawn from the Paris climate deal, and North Korea is now the major issue in the relationship. Although President Trump struck a positive note with President Xi last month, his trip brought to light the issue that will define the relationship, I think, for years to come, and that is it's starting to look like a struggle between two competing governing models and global visions. And for those who read Trump's newly released national security strategy, which was released yesterday, it is clear that the administration views the relationship in this way. In his speech yesterday, Trump said America is currently engaged in a new era of competition, and it seems like America's main competitor is China. He mentioned China, I think, 33 times. Russia was also mentioned quite a few times. And we at the Kissinger Institute, we noticed a surge in articles and commentary in the past year that questioned the long-established American-China policy of engagement. And there was a renewed focus on the competitive aspects, it seemed. And you see this playing out in the policy arena. We see this in Texas Senator Cronin's recent Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act, which is basically beefing up CFIUS, and Trump's refusal to grant China market economy status in the WTO. It is clear, at least from Washington's point of view, that the United States and China is engaged in a long-term competition over who shapes global rules, values, and institutions. But nevertheless, we must remind ourselves that the relationship today is more than a series of public posturings and incidents. It is a slow and historic process in which two great powers learn to engage effectively while managing their differences that at times may seem irreconcilable. In order to understand this relationship, we have to go beyond the headlines and the tweets and look for themes and trends, and this is why the Kissinger Institute launched this annual event 5 years ago. We wanted to not only package a year's worth of events in a compact discussion, but to most importantly tease out the broader themes and trend lines and possibly do a bit of prophesizing. I'm very happy to have with us today two of Washington's best China oracles, Ms. Sun Yun and Mr. Robert Daly. Ms. Sun Yun is a senior associate with the East Asia program at the Stimson Center, and her expertise is in Chinese foreign policy, U.S.-China relations, and China's relations with neighboring countries. Prior to Stimson, Yun was at the Brookings Institution and the International Crisis Group. Robert is the second director of the Kissinger Institute, and prior coming to the Wilson Center, he was director of the China program at the University of Maryland. And prior to that, he spent 6 years in Nanjing as the American director of the Johns Hopkins University Nanjing Center. Thank you both for being here. I should note to our audience that we are broadcasting this event live. So there was a recording, no sudden moves, and will be made available to viewers shortly after. So why don't we just get started? Why don't each of you give us a brief overview of the state of the relationship? And specifically, I want you to frame your response around one question is the United States in a global competition with China, as Trump declared yesterday in his national security strategy? Yun?
Thank you, Sandy, for that introduction, and thank you, Robert, for having me here again. I think this is the second time for me to be here at the end of the year review. So 2 out of 5, yay. So I'll talk mostly from the Chinese perspective about how the Chinese see the U.S.-China relations under the Trump administration. So for China, this year has started with a highly uncertain prospect for the U.S.-China relations. And by the time that this year ends, such uncertainty has increased rather than decreased. This is rather rare if we look at the previous administration's first years with China. So the earlier uncertainty of the Trump administration on China originated from his telephone call with Tsai Ing-wen in December of last year. But then over the past 12 months, the Chinese Sino-US relations has experienced several rounds of fluctuations, including at least 2 honeymoons and 2 rapid ending of such honeymoons. So for example, in February, when China was highly concerned about what Trump's move on Taiwan would be, Ivanka Trump and her family visited the Chinese embassy before the official ending of the Chinese Spring Festival. And this has raised a great hope and great pleasure on the Chinese side. And then the Mar-a-Lago summit in April further made China believe that it is not only possible, but also even conceivable and probable that Trump will be building a friendly and close relationship with the Chinese top leader. But then that was followed by Trump's condemnation on China on issues of North Korea and trade, almost right after the Mar-a-Lago summit. And these condemnations have pushed China to, at least from the Chinese perspective, to continue to make concessions and compromises on these 2 issues, resulting in the announcement of the early harvest early harvest items on trade between the 2 ministries of commerce. But then in June, U.S. and China has the first foreign and security policy dialogue, which is one of the 4 pillars that was announced at Mar-a-Lago. However, the result from that dialogue was extremely thin. Also in June, U.S. announced the sanctions on the Bank of Dandong and also approved the arms sales to Taiwan. And these have convinced observers that the honeymoon between Trump and Xi had already ended. So similarly, the comprehensive economic dialogue, also another pillar of the 4 agreements that the U.S. and China reached during Mar-a-Lago, the comprehensive economic dialogue also did not bring us any surprise in terms of its deliverables. And then very rapidly, within 1 month, U.S. announced the 301 investigation on China's unfair trade practice. Then in September, North Korea had a missile test. China, willingly or unwillingly, after a great round of bargain, joined the UN Security Council Resolution 2375. And then the second round of honeymoon happened when Trump visited China in November. So on the surface, it was very friendly. It was a smooth trip, and China, of course, announced big packages of trade deals with Trump. But after that visit, the visit was followed by even bigger and more serious condemnations by the United States on trade issues of China. So we know that yesterday in his national security strategy, President Trump clearly announced that China to be a strategic rival, to be a competitor, that China steals U.S. intellectual property rights, challenges American power, influence, interests, and China attempts to erode American security and prosperity. Furthermore, he accused China of asserting influence regionally and globally, and of contesting American geopolitical advantages and trying to change the international order in China's favor. So if you are a Chinese leader or if you're a Chinese official sitting in Beijing, these type of remarks or this kind of remarks closes 2017 with a highly unfriendly or even hostile tone on China. I believe that China must have a lot of confusion or questions, and also a sense of contradiction and internal conflicts regarding Trump's policy towards China. So first of all, for the Chinese, Trump's policy appears to be highly unpredictable and changes very rapidly. For example, for the Chinese, Trump met with President Xi in Mar-a-Lago in early April. But very rapidly after that summit, he started condemning China openly on the issue of trade and North Korea. So although China wants to pursue cooperation, but there is a strong sense from the Chinese side that no matter what concession or what compromise China is willing to make, it's never enough for Trump. Then the concern for China is that if we keep making concessions and backing ourselves into a corner, what's going to happen to China's national interest? The second issue is that Trump seems to have a very clear understanding of the preferences of the Chinese leaders and make a distinction between Chinese building good relationship with the Chinese leaders, yet have that realpolitik, that condemning tone towards China on the bilateral level. So on the personal level, he gave Xi Jinping a lot of faith, calling Madame Peng Liyuan a wonderful woman. So those things are appreciated by the Chinese top leaders because they signifies or they suggest that Trump treats Xi as his peer, and Chinese leaders love that. But on the other hand, on the bilateral level, on the country-to-country level, the condemnation from the United States on China has not been reduced by these favorable personal feelings. So for China, these actions do not really correspond with his words and it puts China in a difficult situation. And the Chinese cannot really determine whether Trump is really looking for a fight or he's really looking for a deal. So his tactic on China seems to suggest that he is looking for deals everywhere, on trade, on North Korea. But his strategy, as stipulated by the NSS yesterday, suggests that he seems to be looking for a fight. And last but not least, Trump does not raise a big issue with China's political system and the human rights issue. And that's something that China very much would like to see. However, this avoidance of the political issues or the domestic political issues has not translated into a smooth ride on the U.S.-China relations. The economic security that Trump emphasized in the Chinese eyes is translated as economic nationalism. This all make China to feel that Trump's China policy may not be as transactional as they earlier suspected. Last but not least, so a few words about the global competition between U.S. and China. I think from the Chinese perspective, this rise in great power competition originated from the changing power equilibrium in the international system. So for the Chinese, they are very good at using their advantages, especially the economic resources, to expand their regional and global influence. But this type of competition requires the United States to counter with similar economic competitions. But U.S. has a different system than the Chinese system. China can use state-driven techniques and campaign to promote the Chinese economic influence. But for U.S. to do, or for the U.S. government to do the same thing is going to encounter major difficulties. Because that's a challenge. And this competition is also rising to the level of values, political values and ideology. So China is using its economic campaign to export the Chinese model, the China model, or the Chinese call it the Chinese path. And China has created a model that authoritarian states can learn and feel that they can copycat and transplant into their own countries. And this model has been attractive and has a strong appeal for many of these authoritarian states. And another issue is whether this type of soft power influence or this inspirational power of the Chinese system, whether it's going to have an impact over the U.S. domestic public opinion. And that's an issue that has been catching an increasing level of attention here in the United States. And foreseeably in 2018, it will attract more attention. So I'll stop there. Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Sandy.
Thank you. Robert, go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks, Sandy. I'll start out with your question about whether we are involved in a competition for world leadership. I think the obvious answer is yes, we are. Of course we are. But we've got to unpack this term competition, which admits to various interpretations, and none of which were treated in either President Trump's speech yesterday or in the National Security Strategy document. That document, but especially Trump's speech, seems to imply that this competition is a battle between angels and devils for world dominance. You picture sort of a Hieronymus Bosch painting background as he speaks about competition, and I don't think that's correct. I don't think it is justified. How does this competition come about? The United States and China, over the past several decades, have, like other nations, been working, doing all that they could to maximize their global influence. This is what nations do. They try to create international environments that are conducive to their ends. It is because of China's success with its economic reforms and its economic rise that perfectly normal behavior of China, maximizing global influence, now comes up against the United States' perfectly coherent behavior as well. So the competition arises from normal national behaviors against the background of China's rise. I think this is perhaps the most glaring oversight in the National Security Strategy document, in which it is everywhere implied that Russia and China's international actions, their foreign policies, are in the first instance aimed at harming the United States. This is what the National Security Strategy says. I see no reason to believe this is true. There are instances in which there are clear cases of conflict, but the competition arises primarily from Russia and China attempting to maximize their own self-interest as they see it. I think it's very important to understand that it is not aimed at the United States in the first instance, and we miss that. So again, what do we mean by competition? We've got a problem in speaking about U.S.-China relations now of this 定位问题, 定型. What vocabulary do we use? Competition doesn't seem quite right. To say that it's an adversarial relationship, it's tracking in that direction, but that's not quite right either. So 定位, finding the right vocabulary, is a big issue. The past year's experience, however, and the National Security Strategy document do correctly point out that this competition between the United States and China is now playing out worldwide. It's not just a bilateral competition. And it is also playing out across various sectors. It is geostrategic, it is economic, it is normative, and it is ideational, as you mentioned. And you spoke about prophecy, Sandy, which I don't want to engage in, but I think that at least for 2019, we can safely say that this competition is unlikely to lead to conflict. Again, despite the rather alarmist language in the NSS. So this competition, how dire is it, how manageable, is a big open question. I think that with wisdom, it is still manageable, although getting more concerning. It is not a new Cold War. So, looking back at the past year, in this competition to maximize global influence, I think that it's been a pretty good year for China from its own point of view. China thinks so too. And a poor year for the U.S., which is unsure of what its point of view is. We are still in the midst of a major political crisis, which is also a national identity crisis, the severity of which, in my view, is hard to overstate. I think it's the most concerning such crisis since the Civil War. Xi Jinping and China have made deft use of this crisis and of Americans' anxiety over the Trump election. We saw this first in Xi's speech at Davos, days before Trump's inauguration, in which he announced that if it really had to, China was willing to perhaps lead economic globalization. That rhetoric proceeded through the year in his May speech at the Belt and Road Initiative in Beijing, and then up to the 19th Party Congress. And the difference in that speech compared to Davos was it was no longer, we'll take up this mantle if we must, but we are ready to seize it independently, strongly, and confidently. We saw this progression throughout the year. And more interesting to me than a lot of Xi's rhetoric was global reception. There was quite a bit of skepticism, but overall a welcoming attitude, a fair amount of interest in many countries, and quite a bit of credulity, a willingness to believe that China maybe has solutions and that Xi was actually a strong leader. We'll come back to that. This program is entitled Paper Tiger, Porcelain Dragon for a reason. I think there's a lot of fragility on the Chinese side. But certainly we saw a China on the move in its economic, trade relations, and the various kinds of investments that it has made, and the far larger number of investments that it has announced, especially in connection with what it now calls the Belt and Road Initiative, with far more of those investments announced than actually made. And so there's some tensions and some questions there about how much of this is real. And China has also continued to expand its military capabilities in very important ways, in particular in the Western Pacific. I was struck when we had some major senior leaders from PACOM here in September, and when they were speaking about the United States strategy in the Western Pacific, they no longer speak of a fairly easy maintenance of preeminence, as they did several years ago. They now speak of demonstrating presence in the Western Pacific. This is a big change. And I'm told by friends in the Pentagon that actually our assessments of how we would fare under various scenarios this year, as well as certain increments several years hence, our confidence has gone down as China builds its capability. So I think, again, success for China. This has also been true in technology, and we talked a lot about this last year. We speak about this here a lot at the Kissinger Institute, but especially with the announcement of the Made in China 2025 initiatives in the 10 sectors that China plans to dominate by that year, to which they have added artificial intelligence, use of big data, and they will be making use of these new technologies, should they succeed in their investments, using the world's fastest supercomputers, the world's highest number of STEM students. As we have said here before, China is investing in the infrastructure that will drive the next phase of discovery: quantum computing, quantum satellites, radio telescopes. They're making investments that we cannot make. They're able to bring new technologies to scale in a large market very rapidly and with relatively little regulation, which we can't do. China has also, over the past year, had specific wins, made progress, continued progress in Cambodia and Laos, but also in Myanmar, Thailand, the Philippines, through the 16+1 mechanism in Eastern Europe, and even in Western Europe, particularly in Greece. In this hemisphere also, China has been on the move quite intelligently and quite successfully, and I'm thinking here about Canada and Mexico. Canada is in its negotiations for a free trade agreement with China. Mexico, which has had a poor economic relationship with China for most of the past several decades, is now reconsidering its options, particularly as we push both of our partners through the renegotiations of NAFTA. China is more than waiting in the wings. They're half on the stage and are already offering terms that they might not otherwise, and perhaps successfully beginning to drive a wedge between the North American partners. So these have all been successes of China during the past year, and of course they happen against the background of serial American failures and retreats, almost all of which were self-inflicted. Indeed, the White House would reject the self-inflicted language. These are victories. The withdrawal from TPP, the withdrawal from the Paris Climate Agreement, the skepticism cast on the Iran agreement, even smaller retreats like America's pulling out of UNESCO, all give China opportunities to step up. About 5 years ago when I first came on, we had a young leaders dialogue here, and a friend of ours from the China Institute for International Studies, Ran Zongze, was speaking about China's desire for more space and American power. And he said, everywhere we look, we see America's shadow. 5 years ago, China saw the United States as the major obstacle to the achievement of its goals. We were just, the Kissinger Institute and some of our colleagues were just in Beijing for a meeting with a partner institute, the Counselor's Office of the State Council. And listening to our Chinese interlocutors there, I had the very strong sense, and this is anecdotal, but that we have gone from America the obstacle to America the merely annoying in China's estimation, that they are not as concerned about our ability to counter, and in some important arenas, most notably in Eurasia with Belt and Road, we're not even annoying. We are more or less ignorable as they look west. So we've got America the annoying and the increasingly ignorable against China the inevitable, or so it would seem. There are questions about China's ability to develop the kind of influence and approval that it would like to have internationally. We see that the Belt and Road countries, many Southeast Asian countries, China's other neighbors, while they have a liking for Chinese checks, there is not a great deal of call for increased Chinese influence other than in the economic and in the investment areas. No demand for its leadership and a good deal of suspicion. We see in Australia, New Zealand, the US, Canada, and Europe over the past 6 months in particular, and I think this is an important trend that we need to watch in the coming year, a lot of concern about Chinese influence and infiltration on the soil of those countries through politics, through markets, through universities. There were three mentions in the NSS document yesterday about the openness of American universities as vectors for China and other nations increasing their technological knowledge at our expense. This is another example of the ways in which China's rise is bringing American core values into conflict with each other. And I want to just quickly talk about universities, because I think we'll see more of this in 2018 as well. If you ask universities, sort of qua-universities, in their essence as academic institutions, should America's best universities, their physics departments, chemistry, name it, train China's top students at the PhD level? The answer is unequivocal, absolutely. We cannot have the world's best system of higher education unless we are training the world's top talent and sharing the research and the knowledge that they create. It's a matter of first principles for the universities. But if we come at it from another angle and say, in light of this geostrategic competition, in light of China's influence, competition to develop hypersonic glide reentry vehicles, which is a delivery system for nuclear weapons, should we be letting China's top physics students study aeronautics and astronautics in America's best universities? I would say, despite the unequivocal answer from the academic point of view, we're suckers and fools if we don't even raise the question from the security point of view. But it does place core American values in opposition to each other. This is part of the nature of China's rise. I don't mean to answer this question, but I think that we have to ask it. And I was struck by the repeated mention of universities within the NSS document. China's rise is also meeting a lot of skepticism in Northeast Asia. The recent visit of President Moon did not go well. He did not get a rollback of China's concern about THAAD, and he saw a few of his nation's journalists beaten up by government thugs at what should have been an open forum. The continued crisis in North Korea, much as China would like to stand aside, arms folded, and posit itself as the adult in the room amidst an American-North Korean squabble, the current state of affairs, while clearly a failure of American diplomacy, is also a failure of Chinese diplomacy. There have been no new ideas. So in Southeast Asia, in South Asia, we saw the Indian border dispute, Indian resistance to Belt and Road. There was a great deal of skepticism about the meaning of China's rise. And again, this is why we call this session today Paper Tiger, and I think the Chinese do think Trump is a paper tiger. Porcelain Dragon. My own sense, and at this year in review, we don't always have to justify our opinions. We just throw stuff out there. It's sort of family, living room style. Is that a fair amount of the credulity about Xi Jinping's supposedly vast, unparalleled powers internationally is actually an index of anxiety over and opposition to Trump. It's not just about Xi Jinping in the first instance. So looking ahead to 2018, I think very few bright spots in the relationship right now. I think that what you described, China's feeling that they were doing well during the year under Trump, proves to me once again that despite my many meetings with Chinese diplomats, they don't take me very seriously. Because I told them right along that they couldn't take anything Trump had said to the bank, and I suspect they were hearing the same from a lot of their American interlocutors. Why were they so ready to ignore, I think, the advice from many Americans and think that they had this locked up when they don't?
Thank you, Robert. Well, if you won't describe it as a competition, how would you describe the relationship?
Well, I don't have, the Chinese say 经合关系, competitive and cooperative. I think that is now passé. The relationship is more competitive than otherwise, and it is tracking adversarial. I think it's too soon to say that this is an adversarial relationship, but the trajectories are poor in almost every area of our relationship.
Okay. Well, it's clear that it's been a pretty good year for China, as you said. Prior to Trump's trip to Asia, Time magazine they ran a cover that read, China won. And
it was Ian Bremmer, right? I think it was Ian Bremmer.
There was a series of articles, and he had written one on how China would overtake us economically and the reasons why. Following his trip, there were lots of articles basically mourning U.S. leadership. You had, this is how a superpower commits suicide. That was in the Washington Post. The New York Times ran an article, Trump is ceding global leadership to China, a little less scary. So I guess the question that I get asked a lot, and I would like to ask both of you, is do you think China is able, more importantly, willing, to take on this a lot of people are imposing on it, this leadership role, globally and regionally. You know, Robert, you mentioned a lot of the fragility on the Chinese side. Are they even capable of it? Do they want it? Either one of you? Yoon?
I think the answer is somewhere in between. It's partially able and it's partially willing. So it's certainly willing to assume the global leadership role, but according to the Chinese definition and according to the Chinese pace, that at a pace that the China finds comfortable enough. For example, today, if we ask China to carry the responsibility for the regional peace and stability, say in Northeast Asia, I don't think China is able, and I don't think China is willing. But coming to the issue that the Chinese would say the democratization of the international economic order, or to reform the international systems and international institutions to accommodate China's rise, I think China will claim that we are able and we are willing to assume more leadership roles. But then the question is whether China can actually pick and choose. It's a package, right?
And I pose this as a question, and can they offer specific coherent proposals in the service of reforming the global economic system to accommodate China's rise? What might that mean as a specific? I haven't heard anything yet that's very clear along those lines.
Again, I think it depends on the areas. For example, on the multilateral development institutions like AIIB, I think the Chinese do have a proposal. And they have actually been experimenting and to implement that proposal. But on other areas where China sees itself primarily as a challenger to the existing order or the existing rules of engagement, I don't think China has a comprehensive idea as for what its alternative or the replacement will look like. So it depends on the issue.
Well, so at the 19th Party Congress, she had put forth China's governance model as a viable alternative, and you're saying that it doesn't seem like it's quite clear what that alternative is, even to China? Is that what you're, is that what I'm hearing?
On that issue, that's the Chinese proposal is quite clear. It's what we call China model.
What does Chinese characteristics mean? Tell us that.
Well, here's a debate and the internal conflict of that notion that if we say this is a Chinese system with Chinese characteristics that's fit for China, then how do you transplant that or implement that in another country? And then the Chinese answer will be, well, if Uganda wants to copy the Chinese model, then they have to do that with Uganda characteristics.
But at this point, it all becomes incoherent. I mean, there's this discussion of, Chinese characteristics with Ugandan characteristics. How are we to
China
understand
model
this?
with Uganda characteristics.
Right, but this is just noun piling. That doesn't seem to lead anywhere. I mean, I think you put your finger on it. This really is the question. I mean, what China has been able to achieve, what China has done, derives from what China has been historically, culturally, geographically. And that is irreproducible. And so as with a lot of these other proposals, which are more TIFA or sayings, like the community of common destiny, it's when you get down to specifics, there's a tendency for these to dissolve, has been my assessment to date. Maybe that's wrong.
Yeah, although I would say on the issue of the China model or the Chinese path, as the 19th Party's Congress report called it, the Chinese path, I think that's a conscious effort of the Chinese government to promote the Chinese way of development and governance in less developed countries or any countries that turn to China for advice or for lessons. And the Chinese foreign aid program does have quite a specific and significant chunk of their capacity building programs targeted on this issue. That they call it the exchange of experiences about economic development and political governance, where they bring officials and party cadres and younger generation leaders from, say, Africa to China for 2 weeks to give them lessons as to how China does it, how China manages the opposition views inside China, how China manages the media, how do you use media monitoring to take care of the different opinions that targeting, criticizing the government. So I think there is a conscious campaign from the Chinese side to promote the way that China does its economic development and political governance in less developed countries. And it has its appeal. Look at Ethiopia, how it has copied basically everything from special economic zones to even the party school system inside Ethiopia, and that's from China.
All right. We only have about 25 minutes left, and I think there's probably a lot of questions, right? So I'm going to go straight into that first. Stape, we have a mic, so why don't you hold off because we are recording.
Thank you for those very stimulating presentations. A major theme of the national security strategy is that China and Russia are revisionist countries challenging the U.S. role in the world. This brings back warm memories of the ideological dispute during the Cold War between China and Russia, in which revisionism was a major charge that was issued. But I have a suspicion that that's not what the national security strategy is thinking about. But neither of you referred to revisionism as the characterization of the challenge that the strategy sees Russia and China posing to the United States. Could you expand on this a bit? And how is that relevant to the nature of the challenge that Russia and China do pose to the United States?
Yes, that would seem to be very important language. In my reading of the national security strategy, however, I didn't see many signs on the page that there had been serious and comprehensive thinking of the sort that your question implies about what specifically that might mean. As with its, talk about competition generally, there didn't seem to be that much depth. It seemed to be a stand-in simply for actions and attitudes that we don't like, rather than being based on a really comprehensive worldview. It clearly does mean challenging a system that America has been largely satisfied with, but it doesn't define either why we were satisfied or what the specific challenge is. It's very short on that. And so it rang to me as not quite name-calling, it wasn't that severe, but it was more indicative of an attitude than a deep think. And that was one of the things that I found a little bit worrisome about the national security strategy, which are limited documents. They obligate the administration to nothing. They are not policies. Yet they should give you indications of what the deep strategic thinking of the administration was, and that depth wasn't there, other than by implication that these nations would like an international system which is not conducive to America's greatness or achieving America first. It was also related to, and I thought this was one of the interesting parts of this critique, repression at home and the desire to export that repression. One way to look at the NSS document, whether from the point of view of revisionism or repression, is this was Trump's first major criticism of China's human rights record. China has sort of taken solace in Trump's seeming unwillingness to make those criticisms, his disinterest in human rights. This, I think, indicates that he's more than willing, vis-a-vis China and Russia, to speak of them as he speaks of North Korea, as he speaks of Cuba, that the signs are there. But I didn't see anything in the revisionism language that indicated reference to the recent traditions that you've described. I simply didn't see it, which is why I didn't raise it.
I agree with everything that Bob just said. I think the Chinese has made it very clear that that they want to change the international system. They want to change the international order, but the word that they have carefully chosen is reform. So it's not a complete disruption or the complete change of the order or the system. It's to change it here and there on issues that China finds unaccommodating, or China finds as itself no longer agreeable with the international system. So it's, I don't think it's static. I think it's a dynamic system that continues to evolve. And in the foreseeable future, I think China will have more demand and more areas that it wants to specifically reform related to the international order. Then coming to the NSS, I think the key question that everyone is looking for, especially everyone in China who works on U.S.-China relations, is looking for what are the specific action agendas to counter these challenges. So yes, these are challenging issues, and these are the Chinese real actions that's challenging American leadership or the security and prosperity of the United States. But what are the specific policies that will be designed to counter these moves by China? I think that's where we probably find the substance a little lacking.
There's a piece in today's Atlantic online by Elliot Cohen from SAIS about 3 different ways of framing or understanding these documents at 3 different levels that might be useful to look at. He comes down on looking at this NSS document as the scat of a woodland beast. Tells you certain things, but not specific policies. So if you go to the Atlantic online, you'll see it.
Thank you for that. Please identify yourself.
Hello, Chris McRae, Norman McRae Foundation. So I'm wondering if there's a way to reframe all markets between which ones are sort of win-lose and which ones are win-win, because if you look at sort of youth futures and if sustainability goals mean anything, then there are a lot of ground-up things which are win-win. I was at an education commission summit where Jack Ma was speaking, but so were 30 other national leaders, and they were in agreement that unless we change education, half of all youth will be unemployable everywhere by 2030. Now, that's a challenge, but equally, I was at the AIB summit in Korea this summer, and the next one is in Mumbai. I think that will be an incredibly interesting summit because you will see whether India and China actually mean the same thing by new development banks, which was actually an Indian idea before it was a Chinese idea. So it's just, I'm wondering if we're quarreling over, I mean, I understand aerospace and things, those are competitive markets, but so many things that under 30s need to do from the ground up are potentially win-wins.
Right.
Is that all zero sum?
Well, I'm very resistant to the win-win way of speaking, but I think it's clearly true that China, and this has been another part of its success, is it's providing a growing number of international public goods in a number of spheres. It is welcoming more and more foreign students to Chinese universities, training engineers, training doctors, and we know from our own experience that these folks will go back to their own countries and they will form institutional linkages with China and therefore will be importing some Chinese practices. And this in many cases can be a very good thing. China is providing infrastructure which can be tremendously helpful, which can be transformative. So yes, China is able to do a great deal of good. The pessimism I've been speaking about has been more, for our topic today, the U.S.-China formal relationship, the government-to-government level. There continues to be a great deal going on between institutions, between corporations, professional associations, universities. It's not to deny that.
On the issue of win-win, I think gradually in the past several years there have been this rather cynical interpretations of win-win. The first one is China wins and China wins again. And the second one is, I'm sure you probably have heard of it, because if you look at the Chinese infrastructure financing, those are mostly concessional loans, so they need to be paid back. And the Chinese use those loans, those financing to hire Chinese contractors to produce and to build those infrastructure. So it creates businesses and job opportunities and employment in China, and then the loans will be repaid. It also helps China to penetrate or to infiltrate the areas that it wants to expand its influence. So China wins and China wins again. And the second cynical interpretation is that, well, both countries win, but who wins more?
This is what Secretary Tillerson meant by predatory investment policies.
So when you look at the national interests, yes, there are converging national interests, but there are also diverging national interests. So it depends on which one you prioritize. If you look at the New Development Bank, it was an Indian proposal to begin with, but then the internal competition between China and India over where, for example, the headquarters will be located, will be which country's first president will come from. Those are the issues that China and India could not agree with each other. And some would say that it led to or strengthened the Chinese desire to have AIIB, which is primarily a Chinese creation. So China can have more authority and more say over its structure and personnel appointment. I'll stop there.
It's all fun and games until someone loses, right? Let's go right here, and then we'll go back here, and then that gentleman back there.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. My name is Julian Tucker. I work at the Institute for Security and Development Policy in Stockholm, Sweden. And I would like to ask you if you could comment about where Western Europe fits in this competition between China and the United States. It does seem that in the past year, the relationship between Washington and Brussels or the various European capitals has been more strained than it has been in the past, and that the Chinese or that Beijing is trying to capitalize on this in some sense. Certainly, it appears that, for example, the Estonians have the Trump administration's early comments on NATO and the future of NATO have sent the Estonians into paroxysms of strategic fears, and they have been working very hard over the past year to build up their Estonian soft power in China. So I was wondering if you could comment on Europe's future in this competition. Thank you.
Well, just briefly, and then hand it over to you.
They're always
I
eating with the Europeans,
I have
Robert.
not been to Europe since Trump's election. I have had many, many meetings with European diplomats here, and my experience overall has been that they share most American concerns about China's rise in Western Europe. 16+1 is different and a very interesting case. But Western Europe shares many of our concerns. And for example, the concern about naming China as a market economy, they're very hesitant to do that. However, those concerns are secondary to their concerns about the United States itself and to where the U.S. is headed under the Trump administration. So most of my conversations about U.S.-China relations with Europeans have really been conversations about their anxiety over Trump and what his leadership means to American global leadership. So that's the primary concern. China's secondary, in my view, for them.
I agree.
Third row back.
My name is Stephen Shore. It's a wonderful presentation. One subject that nobody has dealt with is immigration. Now, again, national characteristics can change, and in China they certainly have changed a lot in the last 50 years. But if there's one enduring quality, enduring difference, is that the United States has historically encouraged and economically benefited from immigration, and China has not. And I'm wondering, given the aging population, is there any temptation for the Chinese government to rethink historical attitudes toward immigration, and would China grow even faster were it to do so?
Your turn.
Small question.
That's a small question. I personally don't believe that prospect is going to happen anytime soon, because if you look at China's population reality, China has 1.3 now, approaching 1.4 billion people. So for the Chinese general public, especially for the generation that experienced the one-child policy, they would feel that we implemented this one-child policy for 40 years to do what? To open rooms and open our doors to foreign immigrants? And that's certainly not a proposal that I would say the majority of the Chinese population will find agreeable with. And that also explains China's policy towards the rejection of the international refugees to come to China.
Anybody in the back? No?
No,
All right,
Kent
we'll go
is
Oh, where's Kent?
Kent is way at the back. He's been very patient. Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, we'll go Kent and then come back up. We'll make Ray run around on our last event.
Kent Hughes here at the Wilson Center. Just marvelous presentations about a really serious subject. I wonder if we already see some more concerted reaction to China's success. Sandy mentioned the expansion of CFIUS via Senator Cornyn's proposal. In Germany, in the wake of Chinese purchase of KUKA, the key robotics company, they now have an investment review. If you look at the United Kingdom on the more offensive side, they've come out with their latest industrial policy statement. The Trump executive order in July of this year saying, let's take a look at the industrial base, supply chains, and so forth. Ted Alden's book, Failure to Adjust, a product of the Council on Foreign Relations. I'm doing an injustice to a complicated book, but looking at the state-level industrial policies and saying the U.S. ought to support those. So I wonder if there's how do we, as the West, deal with a rising mercantilist strategy that's been so successful, And how will China react the more we develop a let's say, market-based mercantilism in response?
So I think there was a suggested answer in the national security strategy. One of my big takeaways from that document is it doesn't say this, but it implies that the United States must now adopt the Chinese model of comprehensive national power. It links security with economic interests, with values and ideology, none of these things very clearly defined, but makes them clear that they are all part of this competition. This is why universities are brought into the question. You'll see it throughout the document. And so that, if I were going to sort of say one thing to my Chinese colleagues, is that China's development of comprehensive national power has now resulted in the United States adopting that same idea and a whole of government approach. So you mentioned the reformed CFIUS legislation. We're still waiting on the USTR Lighthizer, the findings of his 301 investigation. I agree with you that this question about the industrial base, and we've spoken about this document that the Trump administration issued last fall was very important, didn't get the attention that it deserved. We are also seeing more hearings on Capitol Hill, one just last week, about the range of Chinese, what is influence, what is infiltration, what is espionage, all being lumped together. And we're seeing this in Australia and New Zealand. So we are seeing a response to China's comprehensive challenge in the beginnings of a comprehensive national power, all of government reply to China. My concern has been and remains, can we take a comprehensive national power approach to fending off the challenge from China without ourselves becoming a national security state? That's going to be, I think, the major question for the United States. But one of the other I think tells for China in looking at the national security document is that China and Russia, Syria, Iran, North Korea, and jihadist terrorists are mentioned 1, 2, 3 over and over again as the major threats. And while there is language which acknowledges that the nature and methods of these threats are different and that we can cooperate at times, this is clearly presented as a spectrum of threats with continuities between them. So I think what we see, in answer to your question, is the beginning of a comprehensive national security approach, which is going to comprise economics, going to make economics a piece of security policy.
Well, what's the role of the private sector in all this then? Media firms, tech companies, we saw Apple, Alphabet, their CEOs go to the internet conference.
So this is again one of the key questions. We spoke earlier about the way that China's rise is bringing fundamental American values into conflict with each other out in the open. This is another instance where the imperatives of the market and of corporate CEOs to maximize shareholders' return on investment is increasingly at odds with this security competition, and we don't know the answer to that. This is why this danger of becoming a national security state looms large. And again, we said this before, can we continue to live with the weaknesses and the vulnerabilities that have always been inherent in our strengths is one form the question takes.
Just very briefly, I think Robert's already answered it really well in his presentation. It essentially comes back to the self-identity of the United States. The best way, well, there's a question as well, what is the best way to deal with a mercantilist approach from China? One way is that China is pragmatic, and you be even more pragmatic than China is. That you bargain, you go for every single fight, and go for a pragmatic approach, and be even more mercantilistic than China is. And the other approach is you take the higher ground. You stick to your principle and show China that we are better than you are, that you might be mercantilist, you might be able to pursue your narrowly defined national interest according to your own selfish and pragmatic way, but we are better than that. But I think now the debate is which one is a better approach?
But is that the debate? Is that debate in fact happening? We see a need for it, but I don't see any signs that this debate actually exists in the United States. I mean, I think you framed it well, but where's the debate?
No, I think the election last year, I would say the Obama administration was more towards the higher ground. We are sticking to our principles. But I think the propensity was a belief of the propensity to engage in a transactional relationship with China by the Trump administration reflects the other side of the debate.
Yeah, this gentleman here was waiting, and then we'll end with Anne, because we have about 5 minutes.
Thank you. I'm Will Embry from DynCorp International. Do you yet have any sense whether there's really any difference between the Obama era security and economic dialogue and what Xi and Trump agreed to on this trip?
Well, my understanding is that the Trump administration for now has ended the economic dialogue because they thought that it was fruitless when they last met in midsummer. And so I have not heard that there are any plans to renew that kind of vehicle where we get a lot of people together at the ministerial, secretarial level to take a comprehensive look at the relationship. So that seems to be on hold for now, right? And that's where
Yes, I think it depends on which pillar you're talking about. If it's a comprehensive economic dialogue, people believe the deliverables were really, really thin. But I think it remains to be seen whether the dialogue will be repeated next year. But then there are other dialogue mechanisms ongoing. Like, for example, before the end of November, U.S. and China has the first round of the chief of staffs of the two military to meet together to talk about the common security concerns here in Washington, D.C. So I think there are different tracks, but the old strategic and economic dialogue is no longer in place.
Anne?
Thank you so much for this really illuminating discussion, and it's a pleasure to have three such esteemed experts talk about this. And so, because all three of you are here, I wanted to ask, I realize that you're not prophesizing, but if you were looking at moments or events in 2018 that you think the population here at the event and online might be interested in looking at or kind of paying particular attention to, what would be either particular moments or particular events that you would urge paying attention to looking forward to 2018?
That was one of my last questions.
Oh.
But please, yeah.
Maybe you go first. That's hard.
I'll be interested to see what happens with all this discussion about reciprocity, particularly in terms of investment. I think this is probably the single most important area to look for. So yes, it's the Pittenger in the House, it's Cornyn Feinstein in the Senate, to see what comes out of that. Do they really broaden the definition of national security? We know that it's primarily aimed at China, such that it changes China's investment strategies. Can we change terms of investment? I'll also be interested to see, although there have been no signs of this recently, as you know, last year there was a call from a number of congressmen and senators to include soft power in the definition of national interests that CFIUS got involved in, to not want China to purchase American soft power assets. That's one of the major issues that I'll be looking at. And then the second one is this question of how we come to see Chinese influence and infiltration in American institutions, political, educational. I think there are signs that that is going to get more contentious.
I probably won't follow specific dates or specific events, but there are two issues that are currently developing that could bring some major tension or pressure to the U.S.-China relations. First one is the ongoing investigation, the 301 investigation on China. And when the Trump administration comes to a conclusion about the result of that investigation, we are going to see some real actions. And I don't think the Chinese will react very well to that conclusion. A second one depends on a third-party factor, which is North Korea. There are speculations about the seventh nuclear test by North Korea. We know that they recently tested their ICBM, the Hwasong-15, but I don't think people are expecting North Korea to stop from here, especially when the dialogue that they hoped for has not yet happened. So when North Korea takes a further provocative moves, I think it will bring U.S. and China back to a very contentious discussion as well what needs to be done.
So we're running out of time, but if you can suggest, this is one of my last questions, a book or a movie that you would recommend to either President Trump or Xi, to read or watch, to help them better formulate policy, what would it be? Go.
You go first.
I gave you these yesterday. So why are you pretending?
Okay. So
calling you out.
for Trump, for Trump, I think Are we assuming it's a book he'd actually read?
Let's pretend that someone's going to read it to him. It's a
so-
book on tape. Book on.
I
General
think that,
Kelly's
I think
gonna read
that,
it
I
to
think
him.
that's actually for both leaders. Mike Green's book, Not by Providence Alone, on the history of American interests and policy, would be a good read for different reasons for each leader. I think that for Xi Jinping to have a better understanding of how America sees its long-term real interests and stakes in the region, and for Trump to give more of a sense of the history and sort of the limits on American power.
a big
And if he's
book.
not actually going to, if it's something we want him to actually read,
It's a big book.
then the story about Ping, which is shorter and still pretty good.
Ian?
Oh, okay. I don't think the leaders will have time for books, but hey, maybe movies. So when Robert was talking about the NSS and how this is between angels and devils and dark force, I was thinking about Star Wars, and I think the Chinese a Chinese leader, if they need a refreshing their memory about how U.S. perceived the Dark Empire, Star Wars would be an interesting choice. And for Trump, how to understand the Chinese grand strategy and how China perceived the region and how China perceived the world, it keeps reminding me of the movie from 2002 by Zhang Yimou. I'm sure everyone has seen it, The Hero. If you think about The Hero, it's really a manifestation of the Chinese version of hegemonic stability. If you remember back before the ending of the movie, when Li Lianjie's Jet Li's character was shot by the 1,000 arrows, he wrote that 天下 all the land under the sky. So what he's really saying is that I support the Emperor Qin to take over all the land under the sky, because only after a strong power unifies the whole China could there be peace. So I think that reflects a lot on the Chinese traditional vision or the version of the peace and stability, how that could be achieved.
After you watch Hero, watch Wolf Warrior 2, which came out in the past year.
China to the rescue. All right, so before we end, I would like to applaud the rest of the Kissinger Institute, Ray Zhong, for her hard work, not only putting this together, and for all the events and projects. This is our last one. I can go back to wedding planning. Please join me in thanking our speakers, Robert and Ms. Sun Yun.
And in thanking Sandy.
Happy holidays.